Welcome to Family Storytime. Let's start with our song. Hello, friends. Hello, friends. Hello, friends. I'm glad to see you here. My name is Karen, and today we've got a story about a story about a story that sounds like a story. This is a story that is attributed to the Passmaquoddy Nation in what we call Maine. Now, with a lot of Native American stories, they don't stay exactly the same when they go from being told in the native language to being told in English. And I know this one has some changes in it. So that's why I say it's a story about a story about a story. But here's how it goes. Once upon a time, a couple lived on the banks of the St. Croix River on the far edge of Maine. Though, at the time, no one had ever thought to call the river St. Croix or the place Maine. They were parents of a grown daughter who was smart, good-looking, and more than a little full of herself. Her name was Ben-Hanem, and she knew she was smart. She knew she was good-looking. And she thought that there was no man who was quite good enough for her. It was a time when fathers had a lot to say about who their daughters married. And frankly, her dad was getting tired of Ben-Hanem thinking she was too good for anyone else. So he told her that he would set up an improbable situation. And whatever young man could figure it out, that would be who she married. Ben-Hanem wasn't so sure about this. But it occurred to her that if some man was wise enough to solve her father's improbable situation, he might be a guy who was worth a try. So this is what her father came up with. You must come to my campfire, and you must make the flames leap high in the air by spitting water on them. Now, naturally, since spitting water puts a fire out rather than makes it bigger, none of the young men who tried were successful. In the forest, near the river, there lived an older woman that many people thought had some sort of magical abilities. Things often seemed to happen a bit oddly when she was around. Their suspicions were right, for she was only pretending to be a woman. In reality, she was a barred owl, and her name was Ko-ko-oh-hoo. She took the form of a human woman when it suited her. Her nephew was a great horned owl named Tetagali, and he was the leader of the owl tribe. He too was young, good-looking, and an owl, of course. He was a young, good-looking owl, and he thought himself to be wise, as owls often do. He wanted a wife he considered worthy of himself, and so far, no one had even come close. It was a time when aunts had a great deal to say about who their nephews married. And even though he was the chief of the whole owl tribe, his aunt was getting rather tired of his attitude. Now, she had heard the man's promise that whoever could make the flames of the fire leap higher by spitting water on them could marry his daughter. And she told her nephew all about it. Tetagali decided that he wanted to meet this young woman. So he flew to a tree overlooking her family's home and watched for several weeks. He thought she just might be a woman who was good enough for him. But of course, he was an owl. Ko-ko-oh-hoo created a magic potion that would make her nephew take the shape of a good-looking young human man. And it also gave him powers that no real human could possess. So, disguised as a handsome young hunter, Tetagali went at once to the home where Ben-Hanem lived. He found her father entertaining the tribal elders around the campfire. "Old man," said the owl in disguise. Tetagali could be quite rude, because you just don't go up to people and say, "Old man." But, "Old man, is it true that you will have your daughter marry whomever can make the flames leap higher by spitting water on them?" "Certainly, young man," said the father. "If you can do that, I will indeed let you marry her." So, Tetagali spit on the glowing embers, which immediately leaped up into a mighty flame. Well, Ben-Hanem could not refuse after her father had made his promise in front of the tribal elders. Tetagali grabbed her by the hand and said, "Let us be married right now." And they were. Part of Tetagali's disguise was to have made a human home near the St. Croix River. And he led Ben-Hanem to his home. He spread out soft bearskin robes for her and did all that a young bridegroom should do for his beloved wife. Well, when Ben-Hanem woke after her first night as a married woman, she gazed at her sleeping husband. "I discovered something terrible!" His ears stuck up from his long, thick black hair, and he had yellowish eyes which he kept half open even when asleep. She sat up in fear, because now she knew that her handsome young husband was not a man. He was a great horned owl. The spell was broken when his aunt Kokohahu entered and nudged her. "What's the matter?" she asked. "Why are you sitting there staring at him like that?" And then Ben-Hanem let out a scream, and she fled in terror. The whole village tried to make her feel better when they heard the story, after they heard about that shocking trick that had been played on her. Tetagali, the great horned owl chief, left the neighborhood because now all of the humans knew who he really was. But you know, he'd really started to fall for Ben-Hanem, and he realized that he still wanted to be married to her. So he waited. He waited, hoping that the people would forget their fear and suspicion of him. And one day, using his aunt's magic, he changed himself once more into a young man who looked very different from the first young man. He'd brought moose and elk meat to the village, and he said, "I have come as a friend from a village nearby, and I have so much food, so I want to invite everybody to a feast." At first, Ben-Hanem and her parents were very suspicious, because they didn't want anything bad to happen again, so they did not accept the invitation. But everyone else said, "Why? He seems like such a nice guy. It would be rude not to go." What are you going to do? So they went. While everyone was feasting, the newcomer said, "Let's tell stories. Has anyone had something strange or funny happen to them?" When it was Ben-Hanan's turn, she looked right at the visitor and she said, "My story must be told in a whisper. So in order to hear it, you must all put your hair back and uncover your ears." Now the guests, who all knew her story, smiled and did as she said, but the visitor did not. "My hearing is very good," he said. "I can hear a whisper from far away. I do not need to uncover my ears." But everyone laughed and chanted, "Uncover them! Uncover them!" "You are being rude," said the visitor. "Stop making all that noise." But they chanted even louder, "Uncover them! Uncover them!" The visitor got very mad and shouted, "Well, all right then, here, look." And throwing back his hair, he uncovered his ears that were standing up like horns. The people from the village were horrified and ran home away from the great horned owl. Kokokahu was angry at her nephew. "This young wife of yours is far too clever," she told him. "We must make something to outwit her." Now, remember, she did have magical powers. So she created a flute that would lure any woman who heard the music into the arms of the man who played it. "Tetagali," she said, "with this, Behanem won't be able to stop herself from coming to you." And so, for a third time, Tetagali the owl disguised himself as a man. But by now, Benahanem and her parents were so leery of strangers that they had moved right into the middle of their village. All the other houses surrounded theirs, and there were always people around. Week after week after week, Tetagali waited. But he could never manage to find a time when Benahanem was alone. How could he play the flute and capture her interest? After weeks and weeks and weeks, one day at last Benahanem said to herself, "It has been so long that we have lived here in the middle of everybody else. I just want to be by myself for a while. And I am tired of feeling afraid of that great horned owl. I'm tired of being afraid and not going outside to do things that are fun. And my fear just makes me feel like I'm in jail. I can't take it anymore. I'm going out for a walk in the woods." Tetagali was also getting tired of waiting, but his aunt was making him watch for a chance to play the magical flute. And he was in a bad mood. He was tired of his human disguise. So he decided that for the afternoon, he was just going to go back to being an owl, a great horned owl. He was sitting high on a tree. "I'm wasting my time, he thought. "My wife is so afraid of me that she stays in the middle of the village. It's hopeless. I must stop thinking about her." But of course, the more you try to stop thinking about something, the more you think about it. And just then, he saw someone coming into the woods. And with his very sharp owl eyes, he recognized her, though he could hardly believe it. And his heart began to beat very fast. Benahanem came right to the bottom of the trunk of the tree. Unaware of her husband's presence, she sat down and said to herself, "It feels so good to be out in the forest again without feeling afraid. I love this." Then she heard sweet sounds that formed into magical music. A flute was playing. She was so caught up in the sound of the flute, she thought, "I must meet the player who makes this wonderful music." And then Tetagali, the great horned owl chief, swooped softly down from his tree, picked her up gently in his huge talons, and carried her off to the village of the owls. Benahanem did learn to live as an owl, but for part of every year, Tetagali would return to his human form, and they would live among Benahanem's family. Benahanem and Tetagali each learned that love was stronger than either of them believing that they were too smart, too good-looking, or better than anyone else. Join me next week for story time. Bye.